You come to Louisiana expecting certain things: the slow-lipped drawl of the Bayou, the humid air full of magnolia and rot, the jazz that slips out of bars at midnight like a promise kept and broken. You expect the map of the state to be a tidy story: colonial ports, plantations pressed into the earth, Civil War markers, oil rigs, and highways that hum with modern life. That's what most visitors imagine when they picture this corner of the American South. But if you let the map blur, if you step away from the postcard scenes and wander down an unnumbered dirt track at dawn, if you listen instead of asking, you'll find a different Louisiana, a place where the landscape keeps secrets so old they predate the idea of America, where stones and river bends and buried mounds refuse the tidy explanations we like to feed ourselves. That tension, between what we expect and what the land quietly insists upon, is where this story begins. I'm inviting you into that tension. Not with the certainty of a textbook, but with the curiosity of someone who wants to know what the world was like before our tidy lines, who believes that rubble, relics, and oral memory still have the power to unsettle the comfortable narratives we tell about the past. This is not a whisper of conspiracy. It is a careful listening to anomalies and awkward dates, to artifacts that should not be where they are, to human bones that suggest stories too strange to be fully explained. I'll take you to swamps with fog clinging to the fields like the last shreds of a shawl, to plantations where the earth underfoot hums with other eras, to river bends that look ordinary until you learn the measurements carved into a submerged stone and feel the floor of history tilt. We will meet places where science has put down its instruments and still found more questions than answers, where myth and method stand toe to toe and neither wants to yield. Here is what I promise: you will not get a neat set of conclusions. You will get instead a careful accumulation of details, dates, measurements, artifacts, trade route glimpses, and the human stories that cling to them, woven with the competing explanations that experts, amateurs, and storytellers have offered. In some cases the evidence points in one direction. In others the facts seem to contradict each other, as if different hands from different eras had been rearranging the evidence like leaves in a storm. But through it all there is a through line. These mysteries matter because they tug at who we are, and where we think we come from. They force us to ask uncomfortable things about migration, contact, belief, and the very capacity of humans to shape and remake landscapes across millennia. Picture this for a moment: you are standing on a low ridge in late autumn, a breeze moving the tall grasses like an audience shifting in its seats. In the distance the Atchafalaya dark ribbon takes a lazy bend, and somewhere along that bend, beneath a moss-choked canopy, there is an earthen mound that local people have walked around for generations without looking too closely, because some places in Louisiana carry superstitions like ornaments. To the casual eye it's a lump of earth. To the archaeologist with patience, it is a palimpsest. You brush away the leaves and find pottery shards that do not match the known styles of nearby cultures. You dig deeper and find radiocarbon dates that predate well-known timelines. Later someone will tell you about legends, a vanished people, a storm that swept in from the sea carrying strangers, a giant who once lived in the marsh. Those legends do not answer the carbon dates, or the isotope analysis. But they complicate the picture in a way that is valuable, because history is not only what we measure, it is also what we remember, misremember, and pass down as warning or wonder. Now let me be fair up front. Louisiana's mysteries are not Hollywood-ready puzzles with single dramatic reveals. Science has a patient, methodical way of approaching these places: excavation, stratigraphy, lab work, peer review, and those methods have solved many puzzles that once looked intractable. But there are still knots that refuse to be untied. There are artifacts that appear outside known trade patterns, skeletons with anomalous features, landscape features that don't line up with climatic reconstructions. In some spots, sonar shows structures under the river that vanish when a different frequency is used. In others, folklore insists that a site was never to be touched because of a curse, and when excavation begins, the data presents a story that seems at once to confirm and to mock the tale. This is the strange dance we'll be watching, the rigorous tools of modern inquiry twined with the ragged threads of oral tradition, the scientific matrix and the mythic scaffold holding equal weight in the narrative because both matter to how humans make meaning from the past. We'll take time to look at the layers. First, the cold facts, precise dates from charcoal and bone, measurements of mound heights and ditch depths, table by table of artifacts found, flint points, shell gorgets, copper beads, shards of ceramics whose tempering technique ties them to distant coasts. We will talk about trade routes that could have been more extensive than previously thought, about isotopic analyses that suggest diets unusual for the place and period, about petroglyphs whose symbol systems are frustratingly fragmentary. But we will also sit with the stories people tell, the old woman in a creaky house who swears a stone in the field is cursed, the fishermen who avoid a certain bend because their father said it was where people disappeared, the scout leader who found bones where children had played for decades. Those human voices are data of a different sort. They do not replace lab notes. They contextualize them, they point to social memory and the way communities create cautionary tales when things cannot be explained. And because this is a cinematic documentary voice, because I write for ears and for the momentum of 1,000 small visuals, I'll ask you to imagine details as we proceed. Picture yourself walking the foggy trail at dawn, toes sinking slightly into peat that has preserved pollen from plants that grew before the levees were raised. Hear the distant croak of frogs, an animal chorus that has watched empires rise and fall and is indifferent to our speculations. See the shine of a copper bead pulled from an ancient burial, light catching across millennia the same way it glints now in a tourist's phone camera. Feel how close we are to both science and story in these moments. The bead has isotopic signatures that hint at a trade network stretching further than our maps predict. The burial's position in the mound suggests ritual practices no longer observed, and in the community's memory there is a tale of travelers who arrived by moonlight and left gifts that felt like omens. The mysteries you will hear about are not isolated curiosities. They are interwoven, a skein of anomalies that together begin to suggest a Louisiana that was far more interconnected and strange than textbooks have admitted. There are mound complexes that appear simultaneously elaborate and intentionally obscure, like chapters of a book with pages ripped out. There are skeletal remains found with pathologies or proportions that prompt debate. Are they cases of unusual childhood diets, evidence of a rare genetic line, or the mislabeling of later intrusive burials? There are geometric earthworks traced by LiDAR in places modern maps mark as swampland, earthworks invisible until we use the right light. There are coastal sites now underwater that once may have been riverbank settlements, their artifacts dispersed by storms and human salvage. Each piece, on its own, is a question. Together they begin to sound like a chorus insisting that our assumptions about migration, contact, and culture in this region may need to be retuned. But here's where it gets tricky. Every time science offers a likely explanation, other data or testimony pushes back. Radiocarbon dates, reliable though they are, come with calibration wiggles. Trade route reconstructions depend on models that sometimes erase the agency of small coastal groups. Oral histories are dismissed as mere folklore until they align with physical evidence, at which point skeptics say the correlation is coincidence. We'll explore these tensions honestly. I'll present the mainstream interpretations: migration along the Gulf Coast, adaptation to rising sea levels, local innovation, and I'll present the counter-interpretations: long-distance voyagers, forgotten civilizations, even the tantalizing and less parsimonious idea of giants or strangers with unfamiliar biologies. I won't present any of these as gospel. What I will do is lay out the evidence and the logic behind each claim, so you can weigh the plausibility yourself as we go. One more promise: the voice here will be human. I will speak with the authority that comes from reading reports and talking to people who have spent years in the field, but I will also let wonder in. There is a moral honesty in admitting we don't know everything. Science advances by admitting gaps. Storytelling flourishes when those gaps are allowed to be mysterious rather than flattened into tidy endings. At times you will feel the thrill of a well-placed date that reorders a timeline. At times the ache of a grave that yields no DNA sample. At times the shiver that comes from standing where your ancestors once stood and realizing how many stories have been lost to changing rivers and draining marshes. So let me invite you, right now, to unclench your expectations. Come with a spirit that appreciates measurement, but also understands the power of the untellable. The Louisiana we will travel through in these pages, and in the scenes you will picture in your mind's eye, is not a single thing. It is a layered landscape of changing coastlines, of human ingenuity in the face of flood and fury, of ritual spaces that no longer make sense to the casual glance. Some of the places we will visit are marked on maps, if thinly. Others exist only in the half-remembered notes of 19th-century surveyors or in the oral tradition of families who have lived beside a mound for generations. In each case, the question is the same: how do we reconcile the artifacts, the stubborn teeth, the misfired pottery, the submerged foundations, with the stories people tell and the methods that scientists apply? We start, then, at a small field site where the soil yields a shard of pottery older than the colonial period by centuries. That shard is our invitation, an invitation to look deeper, to ask uncomfortable chronological questions, to imagine hands far older than our own shaping clay in patterns that seem to come from somewhere else. That shard is not evidence of a grand conspiracy. It is simply a thing that resists the neat boxes we have put around history. And in resisting, it opens the way for a story that is part detective work, part elegy, and part celebration. A story that will take us across mounds and marsh, under rivers and into whispers, and that will leave us standing in the dark with new questions forming on our lips. If you are ready, keep your shoes off the beaten path and your curiosity turned full on. We will begin with the places that most scholars admit are puzzling, then move into the ones that have provoked the most heated debates, where giants are rumored, where stones are said to hum under the moon, where trade routes seem to have crossed in ways that rewrite accepted maps. Along the way you will hear the dates and the data, and you will hear the people who keep these stories alive. Above all, you will be asked to do something rare in our era, to sit with uncertainty and let it teach you. They built Earth like constellations long before anyone in this land was writing a single word, and the first place I want you to stand, quiet, careful, curious, is at one of those constellations. A ring of mounds and ridges that, when you first see it, looks like an accidental hillock until you realize the mound is not a hill at all but a planned, monumental shape that people carried soil to by hand, for reasons we still debate. Imagine, then, this single-sentence idea: Watson Break, an 11-mound complex constructed around 3500 BC, forces us to rethink who could organize large communal labor on this landscape thousands of years earlier than classical mound building chronologies suggested. Now lean in and hear the scaffold of facts before the wonder. Watson Break sits in what is today north-central Louisiana, a low-lying place that would have been a mosaic of wetlands and seasonally flooded ground. Carbon dating of charcoal from construction layers gives us dates clustered around 3500 BC. Placing this site firmly in the late Archaic period and predating by nearly 2 millennia what many had considered the start of organized mound building in the eastern woodlands. The layout includes approximately 11 raised mounds linked by earthen ridges and embankments. The pattern reads like a deliberate plan, not a series of ad hoc burials. Measurements taken by archaeologists show ridgelines that snake and curve, enclosing irregular plazas and defining spaces for activity, extending across an area that would have required the movement of many tons of earth, by hand, over seasons, perhaps generations. The sheer labor investment is staggering when you picture willow baskets and wooden tools ferrying wet soil while people coordinated time, food, and ritual. Key discoveries here include stratified fills and burned hearths that date to the construction events, pottery fragments that appear in later occupational layers but not in the earliest fills, suggesting construction before widespread ceramic use in that locale, and faunal remains that indicate diets rich in riverine resources, fish, turtles, and shellfish. Supporting a hypothesis that mobile hunter-gatherer groups were seasonally sedentary enough to organize large communal works. Isotope analyses from nearby burials showed diets consistent with riverine foraging rather than an agricultural staple, which challenges older models that linked monumental architecture directly with intensive farming. So the data pushes a logical puzzle: how and why did non-agricultural, or lightly agricultural peoples marshal the labor to build monumental earthworks on this scale? One theory leans toward complex social organization developing earlier than we assumed, where ritual calendar obligations or seasonal aggregation created the workforce and social impetus for construction. Another theory suggests long-term population pressure and fertile wetland ecotones forced cooperative engineering as a means of memory and territorial marking. Now, let's be fair. Critics argue that the labor calculus is often exaggerated, that natural processes could have aided mound formation, or that later populations retrofitted natural knolls into ceremonial spaces. Yet careful stratigraphic work shows deliberate human construction layers, not mere accretion. But here's where it gets tricky in a way that makes you slow your breath. Besides scientific interpretations are the threads of local oral tradition and the sensational whisperings that gather around isolated, mysterious mounds. Folk memory speaks of buried people who were taller than us, and of stones that hum when the river is angry. 19th century explorers recorded rumors of giant skeletons, found and then lost, which feed modern imaginations and sometimes distract from the sober work of laboratory analysis. Still, for all the evidence and the sensible models, seasonal aggregation, ritual display, early social complexity, there remains a mythic element that refuses to be domesticated. Some stories suggest these mounds mark places of contact with voyagers from beyond the continental shelf, travelers who moved along ancient coastlines when sea levels and currents were different. Picture yourself walking the foggy trail at dawn toward the highest mound here, the ground cold underfoot, your breath a small cloud. Imagine the voices of people who carried soil there, their songs soft against the reeds, the scrape of baskets keeping a rhythm for generations. Feel how this multisensory image complicates sterile lab numbers, because humans build for many reasons: memory, defense, control, devotion, identity. That pile of earth is both an engineering feat and a human punctuation mark. So what are we left with? Watson Brake insists that monumental thought existed much earlier in North America than textbooks once allowed. It forces archaeologists to revise models of how and when social complexity could emerge without the agrarian trigger. Yet it also leaves us facing tantalizing gaps. Why build a series of mounds rather than one grand mound? What ceremonies, what stories, what power structures did this landscape encode? Were there seasonal congregations, input from distant kin networks, or something else altogether, an organizing cosmology we can only glimpse through pattern and soil? We still don't know. Moving downstream a few hundred miles and forward in time, though not as far forward as you might expect, there is another site that acts like a mirror to Watson Brake, both answering and deepening its riddles: Poverty Point. An earthen complex of ridges and mounds erected roughly between 1700 and 1100 BC that shocked early 20th century archaeologists with its scale and the sophistication of artifacts recovered there. Think of this as a one-sentence teaser. Poverty Point, huge concentric earthworks in an eastern plaza, suggests large-scale, repeatable ceremonial and economic practices and hints at trade networks that stretch to the Gulf and beyond. Historically, Poverty Point sits as a focal point in the lower Mississippi Valley, a place where heat, riverine abundance, and connectivity meet. Precise dates from radiocarbon samples firmly place the height of activity in the late Archaic, and the site includes concentric ridges, clearly planned, that surround a central plaza where artifacts accumulate in thick lenses. Measurements taken by surveyors reveal ridges that arch for hundreds of meters and a central area cleared and leveled in a way that suggests rehearsed performance, or gatherings. The largest earthworks demanded organized labor and long-term planning. The key discoveries here: the baked clay cooking balls, the huge quantities of exotic stones such as Ohio cherts and greenstone, shell beads, and copper fragments, point to a level of exchange and technological interaction that complicates the picture of late Archaic isolation. The artifact assemblage at Poverty Point includes objects whose raw material origins are far from northeastern Louisiana, stone types traceable to the Appalachian foothills, marine shells from the Gulf Coast, and a diversity of items that hint at long-distance movement of goods and ideas. Soil chemistry in the plaza shows repeated burning and surface organization consistent with communal feasting, and spatial analyses suggest designated zones for different crafts or ceremonies. One persuasive theory argues that Poverty Point functioned as a seasonal aggregation center. Dispersed groups converge for rituals, trade, marriage alliances, and labor events, hence the accumulation of exotic materials and the large-scale earthworks. Another theory, more audacious, proposes that Poverty Point was a hub in a pre-agricultural network of traded symbols and goods that created a shared cosmology across a wide region. This theory reframes trade as not merely economic but as ideological consolidation. Skeptics, meanwhile, caution against overinterpreting exotic material presence as proof of regular, structured trade routes. They suggest episodic and opportunistic exchange, perhaps even the movement of objects through multiple hands rather than single, organized caravans. Still, for all the excavation reports and isotopic studies, Poverty Point carries a mythic aura that tugs at storytellers. Local lore and 19th century accounts sometimes speak of people of great stature, or strangers in shells, who taught certain arts. These accounts, often dismissed as folklore, acquire weight when you hold them beside physical evidence that simply does not look locally sourced. Now, let's be fair, myth and archaeology are different disciplines. One records emotion and identity, the other tabulates traces. But both tell us something. Picture yourself standing at the rim of the Poverty Point Plaza as a late sun lowers the air, seeing the concentric ridges like waves frozen in soil, imagining drums echoing through the night and people moving in procession, merchants, ritual specialists, families, sharing foods, songs, and stories. The emotional sensation is immediate. These were intentional spaces made to hold people in a specific social rhythm. And that is the rub. Poverty Point seems to demand an explanation of social coordination that pre-agricultural models struggle to provide, yet it shows unmistakably that such coordination happened. We still don't know. A few counties and centuries away lies another puzzle that sits at the intersection of stone and water. The mysterious submerged timbers and patterned posts found along ancient shorelines, fragments of human craft that suggest coastal settlements now lost to the Gulf's advance. Imagine this one-sentence tease. Submerged village remains off the vanished coastline. Ridges of posts and aligned timbers suggest people adapted to long-term sea level change and perhaps maintained connections across watery thoroughfares that modern maps no longer show. The historical frame here is the late Holocene, during which sea levels and storm patterns shifted regional coastlines. Archaeologists have discovered concentrations of work timbers and cultural materials in what are now shallow offshore areas and tidal flats, and radiocarbon dates place some of that activity in periods when the shoreline would have been further seaward or differently configured. The measurements, depths of a few meters, post holes and pattern arrays, suggest dwellings or fishery structures, sometimes arrayed in ways that look like planned villages rather than temporary camps. When you combine this with the distribution of certain types of pottery and shell tools found both onshore and offshore, a picture emerges of coastal communities whose built environments migrated with the shore, whose economies were tied tightly to estuarine productivity. Key discoveries include post alignments that read like house foundations or fish weirs, concentrations of hearthstones and tools, and faunal remains dominated by estuarine species. One interpretation is straightforward. Rising seas and coastal erosion swallowed these settlements as shorelines migrated inland, and the timber patterns are preserved in anaerobic sediments offshore. Another interpretation is more dynamic. These were maritime communities with robust boat use, long-distance navigation skills, and the social structure to mobilize collective projects like fish weirs and docks. A wilder hypothesis, less accepted but persistent in some local retellings, says these patterns point to contact with seafaring peoples who traveled along the continental shelf, bringing technologies and goods that reshaped local lifeways. Now, let's be fair, the most parsimonious reading is that the coastal environment and technological adaptation explain much. Nonetheless, the submerged patterns raise thorny questions about how much mobility existed and whether our inland-centric models of prehistoric life are skewed. There is also a mythic overlay in the tales fishermen tell. Nets snag on old beams that moan when pulled. Fishermen haul up carved stones with figures not matching known iconography. Those tales sometimes include spectral warnings about disturbing the old docks. The convergence of physical timbers, changed shorelines, and myth makes you imagine the scene. Walk along a receded shoreline at low tide where stumps of old pilings pierce mud, the air smelling of brine and rot. Picture people centuries ago paddling dugouts, carving posts, building platforms for drying fish, tales and songs traveling across waves. The reflective insight here is that when landscapes move, so too do stories and social networks. the archaeological traces preserved in waterlogged sediments are signposts of resilience and adaptation, but also of loss. We still don't know. Across the deltaic sprawl, where rivers braid and the soil remembers flood, there are burial sites whose human remains complicate easy categorizations. The one-sentence teaser, anomalous skeletons, unusual proportions, unique grave goods, found in several burial complexes challenge simple ideas about population continuity and health in the ancient Mississippi Valley. Historically, burial practices across the region varied widely: extended supine burials, flexed interments, mound burials with grave goods including beads and ornaments. In several locales, human remains exhibit pathologies or morphologies that resist straightforward classification. Some skeletons show cranial shapes uncommon for the region, others present isotopic signatures suggesting diets atypical for assumed local populations. Measurements of skeletal elements reveal variability in stature and robustness that have prompted debates about whether there were outsiders, genetic diversity far greater than presumed, or unrecorded population movements. Key data here include dental enamel isotope readings that sometimes suggest childhood spent in different ecological zones, perhaps coastal versus upland, implying mobility or adoption, grave goods that include non-local materials, and occasionally anomalous burial positioning that does not conform to regional norms. One theory reads this as evidence of long-distance migration. People moved in, married in, and left traces of a heterogeneous population. Another theory suggests these anomalies reflect social stratification. Certain individuals had special diets or roles that changed their skeletal development, or that post-depositional processes mixed remains, confusing our interpretations. There is also the less parsimonious but enduring sensational claim, fueled by 19th and 20th century sensationalism, that giants, or a lost race left behind strange skeletons, a claim often debunked but never fully extinguished in public imagination. Now, let's be fair about the evidence and the stories. Scientific methods, DNA analysis, isotopic mapping, contextual stratigraphy, give us enormous power to test hypotheses, and where ancient DNA is preserved, it often tells a straightforward story of ancestral continuity with regional shifts. Yet when DNA fails to preserve, or when isotopic signatures are ambiguous, the silence invites speculation. Picture yourself kneeling in a burial trench, the sun sharp, lifting the fragile edge of a clay bead and thinking of the person who once wore it. Feel the intimacy and the vertigo of reconstructing a life from bone and ornament. The reflective insight is simple and unsettling. Every skeleton is both an individual and a piece of a larger demographic puzzle. Anomalies force us to confront the complexity of human lives rather than the comfort of tidy ancestral charts. We still don't know. Across these sites, mounds built before the age of monumental farming, concentric ridges that hosted feasts and exchanged exotic goods, submerged villages that whisper of changing seas, burials that complicate ancestry. One pattern emerges and then dissolves. Louisiana's ancient record resists a single narrative. Each new technique, from LiDAR scanning to isotope chemistry, reveals new contours and fresh contradictions. For every tidy thesis, there is a stray shard that asks a different question. For every confident timeline, there is an outlier date that insists on plural pasts. As we continue, we will move through more such places: rock art panels whose motifs defy easy categorization, trade caches buried where no known roads led, and mounds that align not with cardinal directions but with braided river bends, each carrying the twin weight of impeccable data and mythic possibility. Keep walking with me. There are more earthworks, more sunken posts, more bone and beaded mysteries to unfold, and with each one the past grows larger and more complicated than we had thought. There is a pattern in how human hands mark a place. Sometimes it is a mound, sometimes a pit, sometimes a shell heap, and sometimes it is a mark cut or pecked into stone where sunlight will catch it in a certain way at certain times of year, an image meant to be seen at dawn or by the light of a new moon. Think of the next place as a language written in stone and soil, rock art panels and petroglyphs scattered across sandstone outcrops and on boulders hidden in lowland hammocks, motifs that refuse easy translation and hint at belief systems no longer in use. Picture this in a single sentence: enigmatic rock art, spirals, handprints, concentric circles, and figures half human, half animal, speaks of ritual landscapes whose meanings slipped when languages shifted and rivers changed course. The historical frame around these markings is broad. Some panels are plausibly ancient, carved or pecked in eras that could range from the late Archaic into the woodland periods and beyond. Others are more recent, the handiwork of historic indigenous actors or of 19th century visitors who left their marks like ghosts. The motifs, though, are consistent enough that they form a visual vocabulary across disparate places, challenging the idea that each group lived in total isolation from its neighbors. What researchers measure here are not only the imagery but the context, patina depth, lichen growth, and the microerosion that can indicate relative age. Some panels sit in sheltered overhangs, protected from weathering. Others occupy exposed ridgelines where rain and sun have softened their edges. When archaeologists map the distribution of these motifs and overlay them with known occupation sites, Marksville villages that date roughly from the 1st centuries BC into the early centuries CE, Coles Creek ceremonial centers from about 700 to 1200 CE, and Plaquemine mounds that extend into the protohistoric era, a pattern of visual continuity emerges. The symbols often cluster near watercourses, near natural choke points where the flow of people and goods would have been controlled, as if they served as markers for passage or as talismans for travelers. Key discoveries include repeated spiral motifs that might encode cosmological systems, stylized canoe forms that suggest watercraft centrality, and anthropomorphic figures wearing regalia reminiscent of iconography found on pottery across the region. When you place these visual elements beside artifacts, ceramic sherds with painted lines, shell gorgets with punched hole motifs, you start to see an aesthetic and symbolic interplay that may represent a shared symbolic system spanning centuries. Several interpretive threads compete here. One theory reads the rock art as territorial markers or clan emblems, visual claims to landscape that would communicate to passing groups who held ritual prerogatives in certain river bends. Another theory, less prosaic but compelling, treats the art as mnemonic devices tied to oral histories and pilgrimage routes, images meant to cue songs or rituals performed at seasonal gatherings. A third, more structuralist interpretation sees the recurring symbols as expressions of a wider cosmology, spirals for water or the wind, concentric circles as the world's layers, handprints as signatures of participation in rites of passage. Now, let's be fair, dating rock art is notoriously difficult, patina analysis can be contentious, and surface repatinations can mask relative chronology. So while stylistic parallels with ceramics or textile patterns can be suggestive, they do not always provide airtight sequences. And here's where it gets tricky. Some panels include motifs that some viewers insist look like old-world iconography, cross-like forms, meanders that recall Mediterranean meander patterns. Such observations have long circulated in local lore and fringe literature. Mainstream scholarship tends to view those similarities as superficial or coincidental, the product of convergent symbolic needs rather than evidence of contact across oceans. Still, for all the cautious scholarship, the images have a power that radiates beyond data tables. Picture yourself crouched under the lip of a sandstone overhang, the echo of your breathing a private drum, tracing with a finger the weathered groove of a spiral carved by hands whose names were never written down. Imagine the person who made it looking out over a river that looks almost the same today as it did when the cut was fresh. The reflective insight here is that rock art anchors human presence to landscape in a way that stone remembers even when stories shift. We still don't know. There are caches too, hidden deposits of artifacts that turn up in unlikely places, sealed under mound fills or tucked into marsh sod as if someone intended them to be found by an unknown future. Think of a one-sentence tease: buried caches, carefully placed assortments of beads, polished stones, and carved bone, suggest ritual economies and intentional acts of memory, sometimes placed where no settlement remains. The context here is variegated. Such caches appear in mortuary contexts, in dedicatory pits beneath plazas, and in hollows where later plows and canals have disturbed but not entirely erased their integrity. Measurements of these caches, counts of beads, typologies of tool forms, and sourcing of raw materials, reveal networks. For instance, pipestone and certain greenstones traceable to distant uplands turn up beside marine shells from the Gulf, a juxtaposition that speaks of objects moved across ecological zones. One particularly evocative find from a lone mound included a carefully wrapped bundle of carved bone, a small polished stone the size of a fist, and a string of tiny shell beads, items not domestic but curated, the archaeological equivalent of a curated playlist meant to be replayed in ritual memory. Interpretations vary widely. A conservative view sees such caches as ritual offerings tied to mound construction, a way to consecrate an edifice, an offering to the spirits of the place. Another voice in the field suggests they could be stake-holding devices in a landscape of claims, created at key points to mark social agreements or alliances, physical treaties written in objects. A more speculative reading imagines caches as components of a seafaring cosmology, talismans to ensure safe passage across waters or to remember those lost to them. Now, let's be fair, determining intent from object assemblage demands caution. Depositional context can be tricky, and disturbances over centuries complicate our ability to read deliberate curation versus opportunistic burial. Yet the care with which some caches are arranged, the wrapping, the placement, the selection of non-utilitarian items, argues for ritual intention. Picture yourself lifting the lid of a thin clay vessel found in the center of a mound and seeing that inside it are not food remains but a small carved effigy, its face blurred by time. Think of the silence that follows, the sense of intimacy with someone centuries gone who performed a careful gesture of remembrance. The human impulse to curate, to mark things as special, is unmistakable. How those curated items moved across the landscape is less clear. We still don't know. Stretching east and south, along drowned riverheads and backs of bayous, there are signs that certain settlements were more maritime than inland-centric models suggest. A cultural tendency to live with one foot in water and one on borrowed land. One-sentence teaser: coastal and estuarine adaptations, raised platforms, fish traps, and shell architecture point to societies whose lifeways centered on watercraft and seasonally shifting shorelines rather than fixed farms. Archaeologists have cataloged shell middens, living floors elevated by shell and earth, and post-mold patterns that suggest longhouses or plank structures, all of which are adaptations for life in dynamic waterfront ecologies. Radiocarbon dates from these features span broad ranges, but when layered against paleo-environmental reconstructions, sediment cores showing estuarine shifts, pollen data indicating marsh encroachment, the picture that emerges is one of resilience, cultures reshaping their built environments to ride the tides of ecological change. Key discoveries here include complex fish weirs documented in historical records and inferred from submerged post patterns, the heavy investment in shell as an architectural and ritual material, and a prevalence of trade goods found inland that likely originated from coastal exchange. Theories about these lifeways propose that mobility and seasonality were not signs of primitiveness but strategies of optimization. People used boats as readily as others used roads, and their social calendars unfolded accordingly, with seasonal aggregation points for trade and ceremony. Another lens focuses on shell as identity. Shells do not merely feed but perform social functions, becoming material markers of status and memory. However, skepticism arises when we try to map these lifeways onto later, land-based Mississippian agricultural polities. Some scholars caution against reading maritime adaptations as precursors to later socioeconomic forms, noting instead that they represent different but equally sophisticated forms of social complexity. Picture the scene: low tide, a maze of mudflats shimmering, the stub of an old piling marking where a dock once was, and nearby, a shell platform so dense it has the odor of time. Imagine people moving on stilts or raised walkways, children learning to balance on skiff edges, elders telling stories about a storm that rearranged the coast and with it the fate of a village. The insight is that adaptive flexibility was a hallmark of survival. The exact contours of how maritime networks intersected with inland polities is a continuing conversation. We still don't know. And then there are the late, dramatic disturbances. What happens when contact and catastrophe collide? Move your mind forward into the era when Europeans were first glimpsed by indigenous observers, when disease, displacement, and colonial economies began remaking the Gulf's human map. A single sentence encapsulation might be: early contact and its aftermath, disease, trade, and forced movement, left archaeological echoes that complicate pre-contact interpretations and raise questions about how much continuity there is between ancient mound builders and later historic tribes. The historical layers here are thick. When smallpox and influenza reached the Gulf in the 16th and 17th centuries, entire communities could vanish or be reconstituted under new pressures. Trade goods, glass beads, metal ornaments, entered symbolic economies that then pivoted away from older material repertoires. Archaeological layers from that era often contain a jumble, indigenous forms alongside European trade items, truncated mound use, and reconstituted village patterns. Measurements of demographic collapse are imprecise but profound. Isotopic stories in bone can shift, and the archaeological record gets messy where continuity is not linear. Competing theories argue over the degree to which later historic tribes are descendants of earlier mound-building populations versus whether demographic collapses and migrations resulted in cultural discontinuities. Some scholars point to genetic and linguistic threads of continuity as arguments for long-term descent. Others highlight the social ruptures that colonial encounters precipitated, new alliances, redefined territories, and borrowed material culture that complicates simple ancestral narratives. Myth enters here powerfully, stories of lost towns swallowed by river or fire, of chiefs who met strange pale strangers and cursed the land, of goods traded for fortunes that could not keep disease at bay. Picture yourself holding a handful of soil from a site where a 17th-century glass bead lies beside an ancient flint point. Feel the lurch of temporal juxtaposition, the way a single scoop of earth can collapse eras into a tight, contradictory knot. The reflective insight is plain. Contact altered trajectories in ways that make reading the past like untangling threads that have been knotted by outsiders. We still don't know. Across these segments, rock art, caches, maritime adaptations, and the deep, often brutal, disruption of early contact, the pattern is the same. The archaeological and the mythic sit next to each other, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in tension. Each dataset, patina, radiocarbon, isotopic ratio, artifact typology, adds a note. Each story, whether sung by elders or scrawled in a 19th-century travelogue, adds another. When you hold them together, you begin to compose a polyphonic history that resists the single-voice narrative. The images persist, spirals cut deep into stone, shell platforms glinting in marsh sun, caches placed with care, skeletons that demand empathy, and the husk of a plaza where 1,000 feet once circled in celebration. These places matter because they remind us that human creativity and adaptation in Louisiana were diverse and experimental, that people negotiated space and memory in ways that left durable, if sometimes cryptic, traces. They also matter because they make us uncomfortable. Our tidy chronologies bend, our assumptions about when complexity appears are challenged, and our reverence for evidence must be matched by an openness to stories that do not fit neatly into laboratory grids. We still don't know. There are other places where the question takes a sharper angle, sites where metal and mineral enter the story and complicate everything we thought we knew about prehistoric exchange and technology. Consider, for a moment, sun-gleaming copper fragments and polished celts found far from any native copper sources, or artifacts of unusual metallurgical composition that show techniques not widely expected in the region at the time of deposition. Think of the one-sentence tease, unexpected metal and exotic stone, objects whose raw material signatures point beyond immediate horizons. Ask whether Louisiana's ancient peoples were part of wider webs of exchange, or whether their material culture was reshaped by visitors whose traces stubbornly resist neat categorization. The historical frame here moves from the late Archaic into the woodland and Mississippian eras, stretching across centuries when trade intensified, and when the rise of mound polities elsewhere on the eastern woodlands created apparent centers of craft specialization. In such contexts, finding a hammered copper ornament on a site in the lower Mississippi Valley or a greenstone adze whose geochemistry points to a distant quarry becomes an electrifying clue. Either goods moved farther than our models say, or objects changed hands in ways our maps have not yet drawn. Archaeological measurements here are precise. Trace element and lead isotope analyses that link artifacts to source outcrops, microwear studies that indicate whether an object was utilitarian or ceremonial, thermal studies on metal artifacts that show if they underwent transformative heating. Key discoveries include copper beads and headdresses, rare mica sheets with cut and hammered edges, and greenstone pieces showing tool polish consistent with long use. One theory suggests these materials were part of exchange networks that stretched from the Appalachian highlands to the Gulf, networks not just of goods, but of people, traders, ritual specialists, and families who moved seasonally, carrying prized objects as both heirlooms and portable economy. Another theory imagines a more localized innovation, that coastal and riverine communities developed specialized skills, perhaps in shell crafting, stone polishing, or metallurgy, independently or through limited contact with itinerant craftspeople. Skeptics insist that isolated finds do not necessarily imply ongoing interregional trade. Objects might have moved through several intermediary hands over generations, making direct links difficult to prove. Yet alongside these sober analyses runs an aura of the uncanny in local stories. Elders recall tales of a buried treasure in a mound, of metal that shone like a sun beneath the grass, of a chief's collar of copper that caused storms when disturbed. 19th-century collectors, too, sometimes embellished their accounts, creating a tangle of fact, rumor, and invention. Still, for all skepticism and hyperbole alike, the metal itself, the glint, the weight, tethers physicality to imagination. Picture standing at twilight over a shallow pit where a small sheet of beaten copper caught the archaeologist's light as it was pulled from the soil, thinking of the hands that hammered it and the ritual throat a bead might have ornamented. Imagine the slow, careful lab work that then ties that copper's chemical fingerprint to our beds miles away, connecting a private, intimate object to a wider world. The reflective insight is that metals and exotic stones functioned as more than currency. They were carriers of stories and authority, signifiers placed on bodies and in caches to make claims that words alone could not hold. We still don't know. Then there are the alignments, the spatial logics that suggest an astronomical awareness some researchers argue was sophisticated and intentional. I mean not merely that mounds point vaguely east or that certain platforms coincide with solstices, but that some complexes show precise orientation to solar risings or to riverways that themselves follow celestial metaphors. One-sentence teaser: celestial alignments in earthworks and monuments, carefully oriented plazas, causeways, and mound pairs, suggest knowledge of seasonal rhythms encoded into the very ground people shaped. The history of such observations has been mixed. Amateur skywatchers in the early 20th century often read pattern where none existed, while later, careful archaeoastronomical studies have shown that certain sites indeed display non-random orientation patterns aligned with solstitial sunrises, lunar standstills, or notable stars. Measurements here involve azimuth readings, horizon profiles, and correlation statistics that test whether alignments exceed what might occur by chance. Key discoveries include mound pairs whose long axes align with marked solar risings at key seasonal moments, plazas that open to river views at precise angles, and post patterns whose spacing could signal calendrical counts. One theory argues these orientations functioned as practical calendars, ways to mark planting or fishing seasons, ritual windows, and communal gatherings tied to ecological cycles. Another posits that alignments encoded mythic cosmologies, reinforcing elite claims by linking leaders to cosmic cycles, or structuring ritual movement across landscape as a reenactment of creation narratives. Critics of archaeoastronomy caution against overinterpretation. Natural topography and drainage needs sometimes determine orientation more than deliberate cosmology. Still, for the communities who inhabited these places, the sky and the ground were not separate. They were reciprocal texts read for survival and meaning. Picture a dawn when light slips across a plaza just so, tracing a path of illumination that highlights a carved post or an altar stone. Imagine the hush of a crowd as the sun strikes a marker and the leader raises a voice. The reflective insight is simple. People whose lives were braided to seasons would anchor ritual to celestial markers because they were reliable, communal references. We still don't know. Not far away, in places the maps call fringes, are the traces of engineered waterworks that whisper of deliberate hydraulic knowledge, canals, ditches, and raised fields that permitted people to manage flood and fertility on a grand scale. Consider the teaser: engineered waterways and modified floodplains, sluices and canals that reconfigure sediment, reveal human planning that coaxed abundance from water's fickle generosity. Historically, manipulated landscapes are often underestimated in the southeast, because the later colonial and industrial reworking of rivers obscured earlier infrastructural logic. Yet LiDAR and sediment coring increasingly reveal networks of linear features, terraces, and filled ditches that appear designed to channel water, trap sediment, and perhaps even to guide fish into harvestable enclosures. Measurements here are technical: sediment thickness, canal gradient, capacity estimates, and the results are provocative. What looks like simple marsh management can, on closer inspection, amount to an agronomic system as sophisticated as terracing or irrigation found elsewhere. Discoveries include grids of low ridges that elevate planting zones above floodwater, ditches aligned to maximize sediment deposition, and palisade canals that funneled fish into traps. One theory frames these features as proto-agricultural intensification, alternatives to plow-based farming suited to the wetlands, where nutrient capture and water management raise yields without heavy tillage. Another interpretation sees them as communal resource management, shared investments that enforce social contracts and seasonal cooperation, not individual property. This is important because it reframes the assumption that only certain landscapes could host complex political economies. Yet skeptics point to the difficulty of dating such modifications and to the possibility that some features are natural levee forms later adapted by people. Picture you wading through knee-deep water at dawn, the mud giving underfoot, the straight edge of a buried canal suddenly revealed as the sunlight slices the mist. Think of generations of people who tamped earth and coaxed sediment to make predictable harvests. The insight is that landscapes are engineered narratives, with human hands continually writing new chapters to cope with ecological constraints. We still don't know. And then there are the stories that refuse to die, legends of lost tribes, of creeks that run red once a year, of mounds that contain the bones of giants taller than present peoples. These tales are often dismissed in academic circles, trimmed as the sensational by the steady hand of data. Yet they persist because they tell psychological truths about displacement, about measures of difference, and about the way communities process trauma. Take the one-sentence tease, legends and oral histories, of giants, lost tribes, and vanished towns, are not mere fairy tales but repositories of cultural memory, often encoding displacement, assimilation, and unrecorded events in a metaphorical vocabulary. The historical dimension here is fraught. Early ethnographers and settlers sometimes misheard or misrepresented indigenous stories, translating metaphor into literal claims that later fueled fantastical narratives. But when oral histories are carefully compared with archaeological and environmental data, they sometimes reveal correspondences, floods memorialized as the river took the town, migrations remembered as encounters with strangers who spoke differently, and social ruptures encoded as monstrous metaphors. Anthropologists measure motifs, compare versions across communities, and cross-check them with dating evidence. Results are enlightening. One interpretive strand reads legends of giants as symbolic registers of ancestor veneration and social memory, a way to speak of forebears with extraordinary attributes and to codify all. Another reads them as mnemonic devices for remembering catastrophic events, storms that rearranged entire coastlines, or epidemics that thinned populations, where attributes are amplified to convey extraordinariness. A third, more controversial voice treats these tales as possible witnesses to biological difference, populations with different stature due to genetics or diet. It is crucial to be clear: extraordinary physical claims require extraordinary evidence, and such proof is rarely forthcoming. Still, the persistence of these tales teaches us about grief, about the human inclination to explain the unexplainable, and about the way metaphor can sometimes hold a more reliable truth about social change than a list of radiocarbon dates can. Picture an elder, the light on their face thin, recounting a story of a town swallowed by the river, and imagine the echo of that story across generations, becoming a motif that shapes identity as much as any treaty. The reflective insight is that stories are archives too. They preserve human reactions to change, even when they lack the empirical markers modern archaeologists seek. We still don't know. As these threads accumulate, metal traded beyond expected horizons, celestial alignments, engineered floodplains, powerful oral traditions, an emergent picture resists simplification. Louisiana's past is a mosaic of ingenuity, exchange, adaptation, and narrative. Each discovery pushes against neat periodization and challenges the convenient categories archaeologists once used. People moved, adapted, traded, and reimagined their world in ways that do not always fit the tidy matrices of early 20th century models. In the shadowy edges between data and legend, where an old story about a mound's curse meets a lab's isotope result, there lies perhaps the truest invitation to wonder, that the past was lived in full sensory detail, animated by people whose ingenuity and folly mirror our own. Keep your curiosity focused and your skepticism balanced. The past will not be summoned by wish, but it will respond to careful attention and humane imagination. We still don't know. When you gather all of this, mounds that predate assumptions, plazas that echo with the footprints of thousands, submerged posts that mark lost shorelines, caches that are private letters to the future, skeletons that complicate our neat genealogies, metals that wink from unexpected places, art that speaks in symbols older than our languages, engineered waterways that show deep environmental thinking, and stories that have weathered like stone, you begin to see a single, stubborn fact. Louisiana's ancient world was not a backwater waiting for civilization. It was a living, experimental landscape where people made choices, failed brilliantly, adapted, and told stories to keep the failures from swallowing memory. This is the thematic stitch that ties together all the anomalies and each stubborn question. People here, whatever their names or tribal affiliations through millennia, acted with purpose and imagination in the face of a difficult environment. They organized labor into mounds and ridges. They moved goods and ideas across strange and wet highways. They sank into marshes technologies and practices that let them harvest abundance. They wrote in stone and soil things intended to last. They told the stories that kept those things meaningful across generations. That, more than any eccentric find or outlier date, is the core revelation these sites offer us. Complexity and care are older and more various than we sometimes allow. Now, let us be honest about what this does and does not mean. It does not mean we have solved every riddle or that the fanciful claims of 19th century collectors about giants or secret foreign voyages are vindicated. Extraordinary claims still require extraordinary evidence, and the scientific method retains its central place in sifting datum from desire. Radiocarbon calibration curves and stratigraphic profiles matter. Isotopic baselines must be solid. DNA analysis hinges on preservation that is not always forthcoming. Yet it does mean we must guard against a different intellectual sin, the arrogance of assuming simplicity where life was complex. When a shard arrives that predates wielded categories, or when a plaza cries out for an explanation of social coordination in a non-agrarian context, the right response is to revise models, not cling to them like charms. The data ask us to be nimble, to allow for plural pasts rather than a single monolithic lineage. And where evidence thins into suggestion, we listen to story and place as legitimate cues, never to replace measurement, but to enrich interpretation. There is a moral dimension to the work, too, that centers on stewardship and respect. Many of the sites we have discussed are on land that has belonged to peoples who have been marginalized or displaced. Others sit under water that is not yet reclaimed. The way we treat those places, how we excavate, publish, curate, and sometimes commercialize them, speaks to our present ethics as much as it ever did to bygone rituals. Oral histories and indigenous perspectives are not obstacles to be sidelined when they complicate a lab narrative. They are essential threads of context. Often elders hold memories, songs, or sacred injunctions about the very places archaeologists study, and those memories carry social truths not measured by meters or isotopes. To ignore them is to reduce the past to artifacts and to forget that artifacts lived inside people who thought, prayed, loved, and feared. Archaeology done well listens, it partners with descendant communities, it respects graves and caches, and it situates interpretation alongside lived cultural memory. When we include local voices, the past becomes not merely an object of knowledge but a shared inheritance that informs how communities see themselves and how outsiders should act. Emotionally, these sites ask us for humility. There is a peculiar kind of hubris in believing that today's best models map perfectly onto the messy, lived realities of 5,000 years ago. When we stand amid an earthwork that required organization on a scale we did not credit to hunter-gatherers, or when we find a bead whose stone came from a distant ridge, we are invited to expand not only our timelines but also our imagination about human possibility. The wonder that follows is not naive. It is tempered by caution but animated by curiosity. The thrill of a well-dated anomaly is not unlike the thrill of spotting an unrecognized star in a familiar sky. Once seen, the map must change. And that map will not be redrawn by one discipline alone. It will require anthropology, geology, paleoecology, ethnography, oral history, and the patient work of laboratory science to form a more honest picture. The human stakes of this inquiry are immediate. Coastal erosion and climate change are eating many of these sites. Levee construction, agricultural development, and urban sprawl have already erased others. Each year that a shoreline recedes washes away a page of human labor and memory. When artifacts and skeletons become salvage archaeology in the face of bulldozers, we must reckon with the loss as both an academic diminishment and a communal bereavement. Preservation is not merely about artifacts in a museum. It is about giving people today the chance to stand where their ancestors stood, to hear the hush of the plaza and feel the weight of history underfoot. It is an ethical act to fight, where possible, to conserve landscapes that still speak and to document thoroughly what cannot be saved. There are practical steps we can take together. Support for community-based archaeology, investment in non-invasive survey methods, and policies that prioritize preservation over development where culturally significant sites are concerned are concrete measures that protect more than data. They protect dignity. Educational outreach that brings local histories into schools counters the erasure that sometimes follows conquest and commerce. And for every armchair enthusiast who spins a tale of giants or utters wild hypotheses about foreign voyages, there are careful researchers in labs and field crews in mud who are translating complexity into responsible narratives. We owe them our patience and our scrutiny, but we also owe them, and the communities they work with, a fair share of decision-making in what gets told and how. Philosophically, these mysteries push us toward a deeper definition of history. History is not simply accumulation of dates and names. It is the slow accretion of choices and meanings that create a people's world. The earthworks, the caches, the rock art, the engineered canals, they are choices manifested materially. They tell us about how human beings in Louisiana organize time, memory, and environment. They remind us that adaptation is inventive and messy, that ritual and economy are braided together, and that the boundary between practical and symbolic is porous in the hands of communities coping with floods and feasts alike. These places also highlight the role of environment as partner, not merely backdrop. Rivers make roads and erase towns, salt marshes feed and sink the same communities. Climate oscillations nudge lifeways into new configurations. The human response is the story worth chronicling. People improvise, iterate, preserve, and tell tales that codify those improvisations for later readers, us. I want you, as a listener and as a citizen of this ongoing story, to feel invited into a modest practice that honors both curiosity and restraint. Walk the margins of maps. Ask about the people who live where study sites are found. Read with a critical heart, delight in discovery but demand transparency about methodologies. Be skeptical of sensational claims but open to new evidence that revises our maps. Support initiatives that involve descendant communities in stewardship. Understand that not every story needs an answer for us to appreciate its meaning. And when you hear a tale about a mound or a sunken dock, allow it to be both a provocation and a doorway, not immediately a proof of otherworldly contact, but a prompt to ask better questions and to demand better records. The payoff of this work is not only intellectual, it is ethical and emotional. When we broaden our timelines and our imaginations, we expand the circle of respect for human ingenuity across time. We recognize that the people who piled earth into Watson Break, who choreographed movements across Poverty Point's plaza, who strung shelves into beaded caches, and who carved spirals into stone were ancestors of thoughtfulness and complexity, people whose decisions shaped the terrain in which their descendants would live. Acknowledging their creativity and their struggles humanizes the past in a way that mere facts never quite accomplish. It also opens us up to empathy. When we stand under the same dawn light because we have access to preserved landscapes and shared stories, we feel less like owners of history and more like custodians. Finally, there is the invitation I promised: keep digging, in more than one sense. Keep digging in archives and in sediment layers. Keep listening to the elders and to the whispers of oral histories. Keep supporting rigorous fieldwork that values communities. Keep holding skepticism and wonder together in the same hand. The past in Louisiana is not a closed book. It's an unfinished manuscript with pages still under water and under sod, with marginal notes written in song and legend. Some paragraphs will be smudged, others will surprise us with clarity. But the process of discovery, slow, collaborative, reverent, is itself a kind of reverence for the human capacity to imagine better ways of living in difficult landscapes. So pause when you can, walk to the edge of a mound or a marsh, and let the land teach you something small and stubborn. Keep digging, some secrets still lie just beneath your feet.